Okay, so this is lecture 1 for English 555. And what we're going to do today is basically look at several ways to approach language from the standpoint of linguistics. And then we're going to give you a breakneck speed summary of the history of linguistics. Very, very short summary. All right, so the 4 approaches that we're going to look at are listed there. And so we're going to start from the prescriptive versus descriptive approach. And this is actually quite straightforward, quite easy to define. But as you will quickly realize, it presents all sorts of problems with, the general public. And to some extent, you may have been affected by this distinction and not quite realizing. So, linguistics is descriptive. Okay? In other words, it looks at the way language works. Okay? It passes no judgment as to whether this is a good or a bad thing. Okay? It just says language works this way, it is what it is, live with it. Okay? So its goal is to describe the internal rules of language. It is how does language work. Okay? And so from this perspective, it is scientific. Okay? The idea is you make claims that can be tested. Okay? Now, the prescriptive approach, on the other hand, is basically when people look at language and say, this is the right way of saying things, or you shouldn't say that because that's wrong. Okay? So they'll say things like, ain't is not a word. They'll say things like, don't split infinitives. That kind of, or axe is not the correct way of saying the word, etc., etc. Those are prescriptive statements, okay? And they're not scientific, okay? Because basically there's no way of testing them. There's no way of saying, is this empirically verifiable? If you say, you should not split infinitives, it's like, why, right? And there is no explanation for that. I mean, I can give you a historical explanation of why this rule, quote unquote, made it into language, which is that in the 18th century, intellectuals who were, codifying the English language, for the vast majority were educated in the old-fashioned medieval kind of education that you were taught Latin. And in Latin, the infinitive is one word. For example, amare, right? And you can't split it because it's one word. It's like the word dog. You can't split the word dog, right? But in English, you have to love, which is 2 words. So you can split the infinitive in English, no problem, but you can't split it in Latin. And so these people said, well, you shouldn't split the infinitive in English because we want English to look like Latin. And of course, that's not a scientific explanation at all. It's just somebody's opinion. The next guy can say, I don't want English to look like Latin, so what? Right? So as you can see, this is not a scientific point, it's just an opinion. I like my infinitives to be split. I don't like my infinitives to be split. I like vanilla ice cream, I like chocolate. Those are not scientific claims. Okay? So, this idea that you can come in and say, this is right or this is wrong, doesn't quite work as far as scientific description of language. Now, things can get confusing because what is really happening here has nothing to do with being right or wrong or speaking properly or not speaking properly, but it has to do with social class. So when you say something like, you use the word ain't, right? Ain't no good place to put this, right? There ain't no good place. All right. People say, well, that's bad English or that's wrong. No, it's not bad English, it's not wrong. People have used ain't for hundreds of years, centuries, okay? But it is associated with lower income dialects. In other words, with the varieties of language spoken by people who have low income, poor people, to understand each other. Okay? So therefore, if you use that kind of language, you sound like somebody who comes from the lower classes. And you don't want to sound like somebody that comes from the lower classes because people who come from the lower classes are discriminated against. You don't want to sound like you are somebody who has no means of subsistence. That's what the idea of a status symbol is. Okay? In other words, when you say to somebody, don't say there ain't no good place for that, say there isn't a good place for that, what you're really saying is, please don't sound like a poor person. Okay? You should sound like an educated person, which is a person that can afford to be educated, i.e. is rich. Okay? So that's what people are really saying. And the same thing goes for, some dialects have a phenomenon called metathesis, which is flipping two sounds. So the word ask becomes axe, right? African American vernacular, which is, a dialect spoken by some African American speakers, does that. And therefore it becomes a variety that people dislike. Why do they dislike the variety? Because it is spoken by people that they dislike. In other words, they're racist. Okay? And so it has nothing to do with whether it's correct or not correct. It is the pronunciation of the word in that dialect. So it's not correct or incorrect. It is what it is, the pronunciation of the word in that dialect. Okay? So it makes absolutely no sense to say that that's not correct. It is correct in that dialect. It depends what dialect you're speaking. If you're speaking AAVE, African American Vernacular English, of course it is the correct pronunciation. That's the way it's pronounced in that dialect. If you're speaking Standard English, well then of course it's not the correct pronunciation, because in Standard English it's ask. Okay? So it's never about is this correct or incorrect. It's always about what dialect are we speaking. Who's allowed to decide what dialect we speak? So that's what the complexity of the issue comes from. The issue is very straightforward. Linguistics is scientific, is descriptive. Prescriptivism is not scientific, and it is prescriptive. It says this is what you should or shouldn't do. But people get really bent out of shape over this because there are social issues that are tied in with this. So here we can look at some examples that are sort of more egregious. The double negative. They say, oh, you shouldn't say, I don't know, nobody. Well, why not? In a plenty of dialects, it's there. Shakespeare uses the double negative. So what does that mean? That Shakespeare was illiterate? No. It just means that in the dialect that Shakespeare spoke, that was perfectly fine. Okay? Split infinitives. Really, is that a problem? Well, apparently for some people it is. And the quote there, of course, is from Star Trek. All those of you live long and prosper. Postponed prepositions. Again, same thing, comes from the people in the 18th century. Latin cannot postpone prepositions, so English shouldn't do it either. But Latin doesn't have phrasal verbs that have a preposition that can wander around. Well, you shouldn't speak English, you should speak like Latin. Okay, that's where the postponed preposition pseudo-rule comes from. So again, none of these rules is really scientific. All of these rules have just to do with either preferences of the individual or this idea that English should sound more like Latin, or this idea that you should avoid varieties of language that are considered substandard or associated with people of limited income or some ethnic groups that people may not like. Now, not all prescriptivism is necessarily wrong-headed. There are some forms of prescriptivism that are fine, and language planning is a good example. For example, you're going to have, maybe not in the United States because it's a very big country, but in a smaller country, you're going to have one kind of textbook that gets adopted by schools, right? And so you have to decide what language are those textbooks going to use, right? When you have a country like Switzerland where they have 4 languages, right? Well, so you have to say, all right, so all 4 languages are going to be accepted in the postal service, in the police, and so on and so forth, right? So that's language planning, and it is a form of prescriptivism because you're going to say everybody needs to be able to speak French, Italian, and German, and Ladino in Switzerland, right? Okay, so that's a form of prescriptivism. Scientific terminology is another form of prescriptivism, right? That is, doctors need to be able to talk to each other, so therefore there is a standardized set of terms, and when you say something like thrombosis, you know what that means because it's a technical term that is taught in medical school. Other things like that. At some point in the 1970s, people started objecting to the fact that you could use the pronoun he to mean he or she, right? Because they felt, rightly so, that this discriminated against the women by making them invisible. So there was a long discussion, and eventually, at least in academic writing, they prevailed, and now people write he or she, or they will use they as the singular pronoun to avoid using he or she. So, the conclusion, not all prescriptivism is necessarily always wrong, but prescriptivism that is based on racism, or that is based on not liking poor people, or that is based on just somebody's opinion that English should sound like Latin, well, that's definitely not particularly a good idea. All right, moving on to the next distinction, we have the distinction between synchronic and diachronic perspective. So this basically boils down to your focus on looking at language. In the diachronic approach, you're looking at language as it changes through time, okay? So you will look at, for example, English the way it is spoken today, English the way it was spoken 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 400 years ago, 500 years ago, Shakespearean times, 600, 700, 800, 900 years ago. Well, it's actually no longer even English. At that point, it's Anglo-Saxon. Before that, 1,500 years ago, it's not even that, it's Germanic. 2,000 years ago, it's Proto-Germanic, and so on and so forth, right? So you look at the change of the language throughout the years, okay? And you can look at the future. For example, very recently, people have started predicting that because of the influx of non-native speakers in English, the th sound, the interdental fricative, will disappear, and people will just start using t instead, right? So we can actually make predictions on what's going to happen in the future, looking at language diachronically, okay? And interestingly enough, you can take this backwards to the point that you can reconstruct languages for which we have no documentation, okay? Because writing was only invented about 3,000 years ago by the Phoenicians, today's Lebanon roughly. But we can go back like 8,000 years to Indo-European, and we have absolutely no written documents because these people didn't have writing, okay? And, so but we still can make very, very good educated guesses as to how they spoke and what words they used, etc. And so we can go back about 8,000 years in the past, and we can reconstruct this Indo-European language, and we can say, what it sounded like, and so on and so forth. But it's actually fascinating stuff. Now, the synchronic approach instead is completely different. It consists of looking at a moment in time. Okay, so for example, you can say English today, right? How does it work? What are the rules that make English work today? Or you can say, English in 1605. What were the rules of English in 1605, right? Or the rules of English in 1821, right? So that is a point in time, and that's the synchronic view. You look at the rules, how does English works in that particular point in time. So the synchronic approach is what we call today, what we think of today as linguistics. The diachronic approach is what we think of as historical linguistics, okay? And that is more, as I said, it's the evolution of language. Whereas synchronic is how does it work at a specific point in time, such as today, okay? All right, very good. And again, both approaches are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with the synchronic or the diachronic approach, but you need to know what you're doing. Are you a synchronic linguist, or are you a diachronic linguist? Are you a historical linguist, or are you a linguist tout court? All right. Next difference, and this one is a very, very fundamental one. It's one of the basic concepts of linguistics, is the difference between competence and performance. And it was introduced with a slightly different terminology by Ferdinand de Saussure, and we'll talk more about him. And then the terminology competence performance was introduced by Noam Chomsky, and again, we'll talk about him as well. But so the competence, or langue, as Saussure calls it, is the capacity of saying a certain sentence. It's the skills that you have in order to be able to speak a certain sentence. Whereas the performance of a certain sentence is when you actually go ahead and say it. Okay? So right now, what you're hearing from me is the performance of a bunch of sentences, and what underlies the performance that you're hearing is a competence that tells me what to do, how to perform these sentences. Okay, so that's the difference. So competence is knowledge, and performance is actually producing actual sounds that you're actually hearing. Okay? So competence is idealized, it's a thought, it's in your head, right? And performance is actually concrete, it's actual sounds that you can actually hear that make actual sound waves, and we'll talk about this in lecture 2. Okay? Now, why is this important? Well, because if you're not careful, you can confuse the two levels. Okay? And, so for example, you can say something and have a hesitation in it, like I just did, right? But unless you're paying attention, you wouldn't even notice this hesitation, because we are trained to remove these competence, these performance problems by our competence. In other words, our competence says, no, that hesitation doesn't matter. What he really meant to say is without the hesitation. Okay? Now think of things like having hiccups. Okay? If you have hiccups, you sound funny. From time to time you go, oop, and while you're speaking, right? But people can still understand what you're saying. They just edit the hiccups out. Okay? The same thing, like right now, right? I made a mistake. I said the same thing, right? But I corrected myself immediately. That was a performance mistake. My competence is perfectly fine. I know what the word sounds like. Okay? If you're intoxicated, you're going to slur words, right? Slur your words. Does that mean that you don't know how to pronounce the words? No, you know perfectly well how to pronounce it, but because you're intoxicated, your muscles are not responding properly, and that's why you're slurring your words. Okay? So, all of these are performance problems, not competence problems. So, when you're trying to establish the rules of language, you're trying to establish the competence level rules of language, not the performance, because the performance might be not that important. Now, of course, you can have competence problems, okay? So you may not know the meaning of a word. You may not know a word. You may have an incorrect understanding of the word. I can give you an example of that with the word verbiage. I encountered the word. I was familiar with the word verbiage, but I'd always encountered it in a negative context. In other words, when people said, oh, this is just verbiage. I don't care about it. I'm not interested. That's just verbiage. It doesn't matter. Well, then one day I came across verbiage used in a neutral sense. It was like in a supermarket, and they said the verbiage of our ad was incorrect. Please realize, this is the correct price of, the eggs or something. And I thought, how odd. And then I looked it up in the dictionary, and lo and behold, my competence was wrong. Verbiage did not have a negative connotation. Verbiage could be used as a perfectly fine, positive, neutral connotation word, in which it just means wording. Okay? But my competence was wrong. I thought that the meaning of the word verbiage was inconsequential wording, not just wording. Okay? Unimportant wording. And so I corrected my competence. Right? So you can have competence problems. Okay? You may not know the word, you may not know the way it's pronounced, that kind of thing. Those are competence problems. Now, you don't need to remember this, but it's a fun example. Look at the sentence, the mouse, the cat, the boy loved, chased, died. Did you understand it? If you're not looking at it with the parentheses that I have listed there, it's almost impossible to understand. Now, if you're looking at it like this in print, with the parentheses, etc., you can figure out that it is the boy loved a cat that chased a mouse that died. Okay? But if you just heard this, you could never figure it out. Okay? Well, that's for a simple reason. Is that these are called center embeddings. It's a technical term that you don't need to remember. But what they do is they tax your short-term memory. Okay? Because we have a short-term memory in our head that is limited to 5 plus or minus 2 items. Okay? It's called the Miller number. Right? So when you have the mouse, now you're waiting for a verb. Right? But instead of getting the verb, you get the cat, right? And your short-term memory is saying, all right, I'm beginning to get full here. I need a verb pretty soon. Then you get the boy. And now you're at 6, right? And then you say loved, you're at 7. You still didn't get the verb for the mouse. Then you get chased, and that's still not the verb for mouse. And your short-term memory says, sorry, too much stuff, I'm going home. And then your brain goes, I don't understand this sentence. Okay? Now, this is a performance problem. Okay? Not a competence problem. Because once you diagram the sentence like this, you can see and you say, oh yeah, I understand what it is. But if you don't see it diagrammed, if you don't get the explanation that I just gave you, you may not be able to get it. So again, there's nothing ungrammatical or wrong about this sentence. It's just that your brain is too small to process it. That's a performance problem, not a competence problem. All right, So linguistics is a science, and we really insist on this. And you've heard me mention this before when we were talking about the prescriptivist and the descriptivist approach. Descriptivism is scientific, and that's why linguists do that. What does it mean to say that linguistics is a science? Well, it means that basically linguistics follows the scientific method. Okay, and because it follows the scientific method, then it is a science. That's how you know if something is scientific, is does it follow the scientific method. So what's the scientific method? How does it work? Well, it works so that you start by observing a phenomenon, right? It can be, in our case, somebody saying a sentence or something, right? And then you create a hypothesis that explains the phenomenon, right? So let's say that you hear somebody say, "Do you have milk?" And then they say, "Can you open the door?" And then they say, "Is Bob home?" And you might say, "All right, well, clearly there is a phenomenon in English that I'm going to call question, and I'm going to say that the rule to create a question is, something." Whatever you decide, right? So you then say, all right, we're going to test this hypothesis. Let's say that the hypothesis is that you always invert the subject and the verb, right? So can you come? I can come, right? So the I can come is the statement. Can you come is the can I come is the question of I can come, right? So that always flipping the subject and the verb is going to give you a question, right? That's my hypothesis. Okay, now we're going to test this hypothesis against the data, and the next bit of data that we get is, ready? That's a question. Right? But there is no subject and verb that are flipped around. It's just an adjective, right? Which means that our theory has been proven wrong, our hypothesis has been proven wrong, and therefore we need to reject the original hypothesis that you only form questions in English by flipping the subject and the verb, and you're going to have to come up with a better hypothesis. Okay? That's the scientific method. Okay? It's just like you take an explanation, a hypothesis that accounts for the data or tries to account for the data. You test it against a phenomenon, against evidence. If it works, all right, you keep going. If it doesn't work, you have to revise your theory. And this is called falsification. Okay? That is the idea that you can prove an hypothesis to be wrong because you say, well, the data that we tested the hypothesis against falsified it. It shows that the hypothesis doesn't work. And you can never prove your hypothesis to be right. You can only say it's not been proven wrong yet. The data are consistent with the hypothesis. You never prove the hypothesis to be right. Okay? Because there must always be the possibility that new data might prove the hypothesis wrong. That's what falsifiability is. If there is no way of proving the hypothesis wrong, then it's not a scientific hypothesis. Remember what I said about you shouldn't split infinitives. Can you prove that you shouldn't split infinitives is correct or incorrect? No, because it's somebody's opinion, right? So there is no way that you can prove that it is not a good theory, right? Because no data can falsify you shouldn't split your infinitives. Well, that's my opinion. I don't care whether the data show that people do it all the time. You shouldn't do it, right? So therefore, it's not a scientific hypothesis. Ah, very good. So now we're going to go into the history of linguistics. And here, a huge caveat. It's going to be a breakneck speed introduction. It would take an entire course, 15 weeks, just to scratch the surface of the history of linguistics. Okay? Because linguistics as a science has been around for a very long time. As a separate science, it starts in the 1700s and, is still going strong today. And of course, there's plenty of linguistic thought and reflection before the 1700s, right? But there is no way that we can talk about all of that. So all that we're doing today is give you a general idea of some, not all, some of the main theories of linguistics and where they come from. Okay? And so we're going to start from historical linguistics because that's the start of the story. And then we're going to go to Saussure's Course of General Linguistics in 1916, which is the founding book. Saussure is the founding father of modern scientific linguistics. Okay? Then we're going to take a look at the American tradition and Sapir and Whorf of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis are a very good example of that. And then you have American structuralism, that's Bloomfield, Harris, and then Bloomfield and Harris are the intellectual fathers of Noam Chomsky, who then is the father of generative transformational linguistics, which was throughout from the 60s to the year 1990s, 2000, was the dominant paradigm in linguistics. And then other paradigms appeared, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay? All right, so we're going to start here with, as I said, this very, very, very short history. So historical linguistics, mostly was dedicated to etymology, to the diachronic view of language, and was really interested in reconstructing how modern languages, so German, French, Italian, Russian, etc., came about and where they came from. And they were able to reconstruct all the way back to Indo-European. Okay? And so Jones, in 1790 something, I forget the exact year, is the first one who noticed that Sanskrit, which is the old form of language spoken in India, had very clear connections with Latin and Greek. And that is the foundation of the whole Indo-European, Indo-India-European, right? Indo-European family of languages. Okay? And so then Rasmus Rask, the Grimm brothers, which you are familiar with from the fairy tales, Schleicher, Werner, who is created Werner's law, Bob and Brugmann, who sort of codified things. These are some of the big names in the field, and you notice that they're all like German, except for Rask, who's Danish. Well, Jones was British, because historical linguistics was primarily developed in Germany in the 1900s. 1900s. Okay, and they achieved a fabulous, fantastic intellectual feat of being able to, elaborate this methodology, which is very complex, of comparing words across languages to be able to reconstruct how words were in the past. And so they were able to reconstruct Indo-European as it was spoken over 8,000 years ago. And that is an impressive feat of intellectual history. However, they were not without their faults. And so Saussure, who was a Swiss-French linguist, And he was trained in historical linguistics, but he became dissatisfied with the whole historical approach, and he felt that you really needed to have a synchronic approach to language to understand it, so that you could do the diachronic approach better if you understood the synchronic approach. And so he thought about it for a long time, and he taught a course for his very advanced students. He had like 10 students in his class, and he died in the 1913, I think. And then his students published posthumously the course that he had taught, the course of general linguistics, in 1916. They published basically the class notes as the course. And that book became enormously influential. As I said, it introduced the distinction between competence and performance, called langue and parole, but it also introduced, systematized and introduced concepts such as the phoneme, the etic-emic distinction, etc., etc. I mean, basically, it is one of the foundational works of linguistics. Now, Saussure himself was influenced by Durkheim, who was a French sociologist, and particularly by the idea of a social fact. Saussure says language is a social fact. What that means is it is the result of a convention. Okay? Words mean what they mean because we all agree as a society that that's what they mean. Okay? And it's a bit of a complicated concept to wrap your head around it. Thank your lucky stars, we don't need to discuss it now. Another influence on Saussure was Whitney, who was an American linguist who had thoughts that were very similar to those that Saussure was going to develop, and Saussure read Whitney and was aware of his work. Now, as you can see, there is an arrow that goes to the side, because then Whitney kind of fathered American linguistics, right? And that goes in that direction. So Saussure, as I said, was super influential, and out of his work came structuralism. And what structuralism basically says is that the way language works is because of the connections between the parts. Okay? Think of an engine. You know, if you have a carburetor and a piston and a manifold in a box, it doesn't work. An engine, in order to work, needs to be put together, and it's the connections between the pieces that make the engine work, right? So that's the basic idea, the basic metaphor that structuralism says. It's the connection between the parts of language that make it what it is. So structuralism kind of split into two schools: the American structuralism, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and then the European branch of structuralism. The one name that you may have heard of is Roland Barthes, a French scholar who did some very, very interesting research. He talked about fashion, he talked about comics and that kind of stuff, and that, his research strongly influenced then a movement called post-structuralism, which rejects the whole idea of structuralism and says very strange things that we don't need to go into. But if you've ever heard of postmodernism, that's where it comes from. Okay? And you don't need to know about that. All right, so now American structuralism, again, an influence of Saussure, but also of Whitney here. Leonard Bloomfield in 1933, I think, yes. In 1933 publishes this book called Language, which is basically a behaviorist description of language. And basically what that means, behaviorism was a very dominant theory in psychology for a long time. The idea is that all that matters is the way the person or the animal behaves, There is no need to postulate a mind, and you don't need to be looking at thinking. What you have is behavior, and thinking is secondary. Okay? So then the idea is that you look at language as verbal behavior, not as, oh, I think of something, I want to say something. No, it's a habit. Language is a form of habit rather than a reaction of the mind. So Bloomfield wrote this book called Language. Bloomfield influenced Zelig Harris, who came up with the idea of transformations. That is the idea that some sentences are connected with others. So if I say, Mary loves John, and I say John is loved by Mary, one is a positive, the other one is the passive sentence. Zelig Harris said, these two sentences are connected. And Noam Chomsky was a student of Harris, and Chomsky then developed this generative transformational grammar, which applies sophisticated mathematical methodologies to language, this became, as I said before, the dominant paradigm in linguistics for 30 years or so, from the 1960s to the end of the 1990s, under several forms. You may have heard of government and binding, or now it's called minimalism. Anyway, so Chomsky was the main force to be reckoned with. His influence has been enormous on the field of linguistics, but not everybody agreed with him. And particularly, there were a group of people who disagreed with him on the role of meaning, on the role of semantics in the linguistic system, and they called themselves generative semanticists. And from generative semantics, a number of approaches emerged, one of which is cognitive linguistics, of which the two big names that started the field are George Lakoff and Ron Langacker. Both of them were influenced by Chomsky and largely fought against him. Okay? But Chomsky's influence was so massive that you couldn't avoid it. I mean, some people did, okay? But most people were reacting to his idea, even if to say I disagree with Chomsky, but they still had to take them into account. Robin Lakoff, who was married to George Lakoff at some point, went off from doing generative semantics to doing sociolinguistics, and she started the whole field of gender and language in 1973. And then, other things like construction grammar, which is quite popular nowadays, and many, many other approaches come from this sort of the splintering off of generative semantics. And then, of course, there are still people who do Chomskyan type linguistics, and that's called minimalism. Now, here we're on the other side of the chart. So this is the anthropological side. Again, influenced by Whitney directly. In the case of American structure, the influence is through Saussure, but here it's a direct influence. So Whitney influenced Boas, who was an anthropologist. And Boas had many students, among which, from our perspective, Sapir is the most important, but other of his students were Ruth Benedict, a major person in anthropology, and Margaret Mead, probably the most famous anthropologist that you might have heard of because of her book on Samoa. So then Sapir influenced Worf, not the same guy from Star Trek, a different guy. Now there is the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, also known as linguistic relativity, which basically says that the language that you speak either determines, and that's the strong version, or influences, that's the weak version, your thinking. Okay? And if any of you have seen this movie, the title of which escapes me right now.
Arrival.
Arrival, yes, there you go. Thank you, Dr. Pickering is standing outside. If you've seen this movie, Arrival, it is usually influenced by an extremely strong deterministic form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So if you haven't seen the movie, watch it and laugh hysterically when they show the house of the linguist. No linguist can afford that house. It's one of the very few movies with a linguist as a protagonist in a Hollywood movie. So remember I said that some people did escape the influence of Chomsky. Wallace Chafe is one such person. He was basically trained in philology, the old-fashioned sort of German style thing, and then he was influenced by Sapir and other anthropological work, and he went on with many others to essentially form this school of, and mostly they're in California, that's why we call it California, but basically anthropological linguistics. And that's really an approach to linguistics that looks at it as part of the culture, as part of the anthropology of the people. And as I said at the beginning, this is not a complete picture of the whole field of linguistics. There's many other schools that we haven't even mentioned. So a good example is there's a whole approach called conversation analysis, which you may encounter, you may even want to use, which itself was influenced by ethnomethodology, which itself is influenced by phenomenology. And so that's a completely different approach that looks at language from an approach that has virtually nothing to do with anything that we've done so far. You have corpus linguistics, which is again a completely different approach that's not related to most of what we've talked about today, etc., etc., etc. There are all sorts of approaches to linguistics that we've not been able to cover because, as I said, you could be 15 weeks and you barely be scratching the surface. There are books, there are encyclopedias about the various methods of linguistics if you're interested in knowing more about it. But the theories that we've mentioned here, this kind of grand scheme is roughly mainstream linguistics, and with, of course, sociolinguistics, which we haven't even talked about today, is the kind of stuff that is you're most likely to be exposed to in your master's in applied linguistics. This is the introductory class for. All right. So just to wrap things up, I have a quick practical tip to succeed in this class. Let's talk about math for a second. No, we're not going to teach you math, relax. But I'm going to explain to you why you, or many people that you may know, encounters difficulties when dealing with math. And the reason is that in order to learn math, you have to add each concept on the previous one. Okay? So, for example, multiplication is just addition repeated. So 2 times 3 is 2 plus 2 plus 2. Right? Division is multiplication in reverse. Right? Powers, if I say 2 to the third power, it's multiplication multiplied, right? The square root is power in reverse. So, suppose that you are trying to understand the square root, but you don't understand powers. You'll never get it, okay? Because in order to understand square roots, you must understand powers. And in order to understand powers, you must understand multiplication. But in order to understand multiplication, you must understand addition. So that's what I mean, that each concept builds on the previous one. Linguistics is exactly like this, is that every concept builds on the previous one. Literature is not. You don't need to understand Hamlet in order to understand Jane Austen. Okay? You don't need to understand metaphor in order to understand metonymy. Okay? You don't need to understand theater in order to understand film. Okay? So you can start anywhere. You can take any novel and read it and understand it. Okay? Not so in linguistics. In linguistics, in order to understand phonology, you must understand phonetics. In order to understand morphology, you must understand phonology. If you don't understand morphology, you'll never understand syntax. Okay? So because of this, it's crucial that you don't try to cram the week before the final. It's not going to happen. You need to do step by step. And you need to do it in the order in which we present the material. There is a reason why it's called Lecture 1, Lecture 2, Lecture 3. You should do first Lecture 1, then Lecture 2, then Lecture 3. If you don't do that, the risk of failing is very, very high. Okay? So take my advice, do it one day at a time, and keep up with the work. If you fall behind, it's going to be extremely difficult, especially if this is the 5-week version of the class. It's going to be extremely difficult to make up the work and understand what the lecture means, because the lecture will be completely opaque if you haven't done and assimilated the material that came before. All right? Now, I hope I haven't scared you. It's perfectly feasible, provided that you keep up with the class. Okay? And if you have questions, as always, ask Dr. Pickering. She's very nice, doesn't bite, and she will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.